You're watching News 10. This is an ABC News special, The 2000 Vote. Now reporting, Peter Jennings.
Welcome back to our coverage of election night from our election headquarters here at Times Square in New York. It is now 8 o'clock Eastern Time. The polls have closed in 16 more states and the District of Columbia. This will make for 27 states which have already closed, some of which we've been able to project, others have been too close to call. But we are now able to make a projection in the state of Florida. ABC News projects that Al Gore wins the state of Florida and its 25 electoral votes give him the first big state momentum of the evening. This is the biggest state where the race has been close and the fourth biggest electoral prize. We also now take a look at Pennsylvania, the other of the big three battleground states. We reckon that is still too close to call. Similarly with Michigan, we believe Michigan, 18 electoral votes, is still too close to call, one of the real battleground states this year. In North Carolina, we project that George W. Bush wins the 14 electoral votes there. Mr. Gore did not compete very strongly for it. In Missouri, another of the battleground states, we believe it is currently too close to call based on the information we have. The polls have just closed there. In Tennessee, Mr. Gore's home state, too close to call, 11 electoral votes there. In Maine, still too close to call there with its 4 electoral votes. Maine getting a lot of attention at the presidential level this year. In Illinois, we project that Al Gore is the winner. 22 electoral votes, not a great surprise, fairly tightly fought at the end, but it has voted with the winner in every election but one since 1920. We had projected that Al Gore is indeed the winner in Texas with its 32 electoral votes. I beg your pardon, I take that back. That's George Bush in Texas. In Alabama, we project that George Bush is the winner with its 9 electoral votes, one of the most reliably Republican states in presidential politics. We project Mr. Bush is the winner in Mississippi with its 7 electoral votes. We project Mr. Bush is the winner in Oklahoma, which borders Texas, who would not be a competitive state in any case. Its 8 electoral votes go to Mr. Bush. Kansas, not competitive in presidential politics, very Republican. We project that it's going to go to Mr. Bush. In New Jersey, we project that the winner is Mr. Gore. Again, not an enormous surprise. Mr. Bush made a last-minute stop on Saturday before the election, but it goes to Mr. Gore. We project that Mr. Gore is the winner in Massachusetts. Gave Mr. Clinton his biggest winning margin, very strong Democratic tradition in Massachusetts. And we project that Mr. Gore is the winner in Connecticut with the help of Mr. Joe Lieberman, his vice presidential candidate, and we project that Mr. Gore is the winner in Maryland. Now let's pause for just a few seconds now to let some stations join us as ABC 2000 continues.
See that right now than these states that we have been talking about. The home state of Al Gore, Tennessee, he kept insisting that he was going to win it, but all the indications is that George Bush has a very strong hold on that state with 2 Republican senators and 1 Republican governor. Then you move up into the other states. Pennsylvania is in that equation as well, and also the state of Ohio is still in there as a too close to call state.
The fact we projected Florida and Michigan before we projected Ohio for Bush is indeed surprising. Very telling. Very telling.
It is, because that was a state that they were counting on. And also the tiny state of New Hampshire, where it all began, and a lot of people were counting on that state as well to be one more harbinger of what is likely to come before this long evening is out. Well, you've heard it from both Tom Ridge and from Bill Daley. You have to strap on your seatbelts, expect a long evening ahead. We've been saying that right along. Katie Couric is down at Rockefeller Plaza. Katie, you've been looking at these exit polls. They tell you what voters are thinking as they go to the polls today. Why don't you share some of that with us now?
Well, Tom, we're going to have more on that in just a few minutes. But first, Missouri is one of those states that you have yet to call, or that NBC has yet to call. And there's a reason for that. NBC's Fred Francis is in the Show Me state. He's in St. Louis. Fred, what seems to be the problem? Why are they keeping the polls open later than anticipated?
Well, there's been some real drama here, Katie, in the last 3 hours. The Democrats in St. Louis went to state court complaining that there were voter irregularities in largely Democratic precincts. They went into state court and they asked the state court to keep the polls open an extra 3 hours. While that was happening, lawyers for the GOP and Mr. Cheney and Mr. Bush went into federal court to block that move and lost. So as of about 5 minutes ago, the polls in the city of St. Louis are open another 3 hours. The significance, obviously, several extra thousand votes in a state that is in play, a state that is a toss-up, that no one knows which way to...
7 p.m. So there was no particularly legal issue in there. Now we're going to talk to our resident historian, Michael Beschloss, who's with us on all of these occasions. He's in Washington tonight. Michael, I'm always wanting to test you. Let me test you a little bit here on close elections. 1960.
1960 is the classic, Peter. You know, tonight is the first presidential election in my lifetime, my adult lifetime, where I didn't know at the beginning of the evening who was going to win that election. The classic of this was 1960. John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, very close. At this point in the evening, believe it or not, one of the networks, not ABC, predicted that Nixon would be the victor by 100 to 1. That shows you how primitive the technology was in those days. But what was happening there was that there was a big break to Kennedy at the end, and it happened from two things. Number one, bad economic news. Number two, Dwight Eisenhower, the most popular man in America, had been campaigning for Nixon, really helping him. Nixon pulled him off the campaign trail, said, "General, it might strain your heart." That probably lost Nixon that election.
Now, I recall in 1968, when there was a third-party candidate in George Wallace, the election didn't get called at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Didn't get called until very late, and we were worried that year about the Electoral College, too, because there was the great possibility that Richard Nixon and Hubert Humphrey might not get enough votes to get above 270, and the man who would hold the balance would be George Wallace of Alabama, and that Nixon and Humphrey might be put into a position where they'd have to make a deal with George Wallace to win the presidency.
Now, when presidential candidates have been out campaigning for that one last vote for that one last hour this year, they've been talking about 1976.
1976, Gerald Ford against Jimmy Carter. Into that election, people were saying that Gerald Ford had made back his 33-point lag behind Jimmy Carter in the summer. Many said that if Ford had gone on a day or two, he could have won that election. It was heartbreakingly close. He didn't declare that he had been defeated until the next morning, as we're seeing on the screen. His voice was very hoarse. I think we're probably seeing it right here. He calls on Betty Ford, his wife, to actually read his telegram to Jimmy Carter.
Many thanks. Oh, sorry. Just hearing his voice there. Thank you, Michael. I'm going to come back to you in just a moment, if I may, and talk about the Electoral College. But let's go to our political director first, Mark Halperin. What are you doing over there in trying to figure out the computations? Al Gore's now won Florida and Michigan. Pennsylvania's to come of the three big three. If he wins the big three of these battleground states, does that put him up to 270?
It gets him really close. It gets him really close. You know, Florida is a state that Governor Bush counted in every calculation we've talked about. His brother being the governor of Florida. We've talked about it being a Republican state at the presidential level. And yet, adding it to Al Gore's column gives him a really big leg up. They're really focused on Pennsylvania now, the third of the big three that we've not called for him. If they have those three, assuming they win the other big state in California, which they've been counting on all along, which we've not called, of course.
How close was Florida? How close was California in the final polls? Do you remember?
It got tight in some of the public polls. The Democrats were very confident coming in. Of course, Governor Bush campaigned there at the end, spent money there. But if he's able to win California, Florida, Michigan, if they're able to win Pennsylvania, New York, Illinois, those are big states. And that gets him real close to 270. Not all the way there, though, by any means. One
of the reasons we'll come back and talk about the Electoral College before too long. George Stephanopoulos, you want to add to this?
Well, that's what's so astonishing here. I mean, I would have never thought a month ago that a candidate could win the big three states and still be in danger of not winning the Electoral College. But even if they win those big three states, they still have to win one of New Mexico, Iowa, Wisconsin, Oregon, Arizona, or Colorado. None of those are sure things. So again, we're going back to those states I talked about earlier, the Dukakis Six, places like Iowa and Wisconsin. Sure things for Democrats in the past, not a sure thing for Al Gore now, and that could be the difference.
George, take a look at the map, the big national map at the moment, because we're already beginning to see a fill-in of the red for the Republicans in the South, with the exception of Florida there. And as we look before the campaign ended, it was very Republican in the South now.
And still is. It almost looks like we're, you know, you look at the Mason-Dixon line, you're going to see a lot of blue above it, a lot of red below it. And The big one there, of course, is Tennessee. Tennessee and Arkansas, the home states of Vice President Gore and President Clinton. If Al Gore can't win Tennessee, he'd be the first candidate since 1972, George McGovern, not to win his home state.
Okay. I want to go back to Michael Beschloss in Washington. Michael, give us the absolute simplest version, if you would, to start with, on why the Electoral College.
Well, you know, when the founders were trying to create this system, they were worried about a couple of things. They were worried that this would be a union that ignored the states. They also, at the beginning, there were a few million people with very great transportation and communications difficulties, and they were also against popular will. They didn't want there to be a direct vote by the people for president. They thought that might be too dangerous. So the result was that they had this electoral college system, and you know, the rap against it is that it overrepresents rural states, you can have faithless electors, it's against the popular will. But you know, we're also seeing something tonight, and that is that it also compels a presidential candidate to pay attention to a state like Florida, to go down there, educate himself about local issues in a way that he probably would not if there was a case in which you had simply a popular vote.
You use just one word that I think people are not always clear about, which is this word dangerous. In a couple of seconds, did the founders believe it was dangerous to give the vote to the common man, or the dangers the common man wouldn't be fully informed about elections?
They thought that both of those things were dangerous. They were very much for representative democracy. They wanted some kind of intermediary. That was the Electoral College.
Okay, thanks, Michael. We'll be back to you before long. Take a look at our national map now. Mr. Bush has 130 electoral votes. Mr. Bush has 119. As George Stephanopoulos said, look at the red there. Look at that blue in Florida. Mr. Bush, Mr. Gore has won in Florida. We're going to break for a few minutes to let ABC News stations all across the country get you up to date on your local news. I'm Peter Jennings. Thank you for joining us. We hope you'll stay with us.
Order within 60 seconds or the commission's waived. Find out more at Daytech.com. Daytech Online, built to trade.
Come to Texas with me next month.
In one shattering moment, Camelot comes to an end and life after JFK begins.
He's an American war hero, accused of murder. But could it be a plot to destroy him? Who killed the colonel's wife? 48 Hours, Thursday.
Back at CBS News, election accuracy central. With 270 electoral votes needed to win, Bush has 121, Gore has 119. The electoral map looks this way. Red, those states have been carried by Bush. Blue, including Florida, Illinois, and Michigan, and New Jersey, been carried by Gore. The interesting thing at this moment, these states in white are states where the polls have closed, but we do not yet have decisions. The two big ones, Ohio and Pennsylvania. If Bush were to win one, never mind both of those, he would jump far out front again. However, while the polls have closed, we simply don't know how they're going to go. Same story in West Virginia. Missouri's 11 electoral votes are up for grabs. And Tennessee, keep an eye on Tennessee. Is it going to be the state that denies Al Gore the presidency? The polls are closed there. Maybe a while before we know, but something to watch. Also down in Alabama, a state that you would have thought could have been called early, expected to go Republican, has not yet been called. Once again, the electoral vote count, 121 for Bush, 119 for Gore, and the big states hanging out there now are Pennsylvania with 23, Ohio with 21, Missouri and Tennessee with 11 each, to say nothing of Alabama, which has 9. Dan Rather at CBS News Election Headquarters in New York. Stay with us.